On November 17th, 2023, Jamina Clay resigned from her post on the Montgomery County School Board in Pennsylvania because of her comments on social media about the Israeli Defense Force. Her words describe the IDF as a terrorist organization that is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. Of course, her comments caused hysteria among people who are either Jewish or hold a pro-Israel sentiment within the surrounding community, which led to her resignation and scolding from the school district superintendent and community members. Their reaction and her predictable and pacifist resignation that usually comes with compulsion places us once again at the crux of a question that I believe is making more progress in being answered than ever before. Were her words anti-Semitic? Or are we living in an era protected by pseudo anti-defamation activism while being brutalized by anti-definition activists? The Anti-Defamation League defines anti-Semitism as the belief or behavior hostile towards Jews just because they are Jewish. It may take the form of religious teachings that proclaim the inferiority of Jews, for instance, or political efforts to isolate, oppress, or otherwise injure them. It may also include prejudiced or stereotyped views about Jews. Oxford Dictionary defines anti-Semitism as hate towards or unfair treatment of Jewish people. Now, based on those objective definitions that come from one pro-Jewish source and one neutral source, how in the world do we categorize Jamina Clay's description of the IDF as anti-Semitic, offensive, despicable, or any other adjective given by those that contributed to the hysteria that led to her resignation? The objective truth that eliminates feelings and honors facts tells us that we can't. In no way did Jamina Clay show hate, distribute unfair treatment, or make an effort to isolate, oppress, or make Jewish people inferior. But what she did do was offer a perspective to those who are contributing to the decay of the social fabric and humanity of the world by demonizing people under the guise of anti-defamation, when it is those whose actions are vandalizing truth with their weapons that are formed within the camps of anti-definition. I know what you're thinking. How does Jesus have anything to do with the firing of Jamina Clay and her ill-defined charge of anti-Semitism? One word puts Jesus all in the middle of this situation: logos. Dictionary.com defines logos in two ways to help our ethical and critical thinking. It explains it philosophically as the rational principle that governs and develops the universe. It defines it theologically as the divine word or reason incarnate in Jesus Christ. We see this in John 1, verses 1 through 14. Logos is the rational principle to develop and govern the universe. It tells us what is objectively true in the universe and how we get to that objectivity. In Christian theology, we believe that Jesus is the rational principle. We believe the principle is a person. Hence, John 1, verses 1 through 4. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and darkness has not overcome it. In layperson's terms, Jesus has created everything good. It only deviates from good when we pervert it. Light and darkness contrast like truth and lies, an objective and subjective definition. Hatred is wrong. Anti-Semitism is terrible, just like anti-black, anti-Asian, anti-indigenous American, or anti-white. They are all wrong, but must be objectively defined before indicting one as anti-anything. So if we look at Jamina's claim through the objective lens and definitions of anti-Semitism, we can come to the proper conclusion of what we must resolve in ourselves or what we must rebuke in her. Jamina called the Israeli Defense Force a terrorist organization. If we are talking about the IDF from its inception, we must say her claim is categorically false. The IDF does not identify as a terrorist group. Still, suppose we have facts of terrorism that the IDF committed against a group of people. In that case, we can conclude that even if their origins are an army gathered to defend their country, their actions have been adjusted to fit the objective definition of a terrorist organization. But here's where it gets tricky. There is no objective international definition of terrorism or an accurate international boundary line of self-defense after being attacked. The Practical Guide of Humanitarian Law informs us that, quote, international law provides no clear definition for the term terrorism. It has political and ideological connotations. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Despite attempts by the United Nations, states have not yet agreed upon a definition of terrorism. Nonetheless, we will keep in mind the definitions proposed by the United Nations and the European Union, end quote. Since these definitions are suggestive and not objective, they can help us get a grasp on how to define terrorism, but give us no right to indict any party of terrorism. Article 51 of the United Nations Charter informs us, quote, nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense, and if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. Measures taken by members in the exercise of this right of self-defense shall be immediately reported to the Security Council and shall not in any way affect the authority and responsibility of the Security Council under the present charter to take at any time such action as it deems necessary in order to maintain or restore international peace and security. This end quote. This article concludes that a nation can do whatever it wants to defend itself until the United Nations Security Council decides to say differently. If that's the case, then how are people around the world convicted of and labeled as terrorists? They seem to be convicted of terrorism or marked as terrorists by popular or influential political opinion that is often determined by ethnic lines. In October of 2022, the Harvard Law Review published an essay by Khalid Bedone titled On Terrorists and Freedom Fighters, which drew from the adage that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Khalid noticed a discrepancy in how this adage is applied in real time. The basic understanding of this discrepancy is if you are of white skin, you are considered a freedom fighter. But if you are of brown or black skin, and especially Muslim faith, and not backed by a widespread community of people with white skin, then you are considered a terrorist. Khalid uses the war in Ukraine as his backdrop to explain his point. Khalid states in his essay, quote, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in late March of 2022 ushered in a new chapter of war on the European continent. For a Russian regime intent on actualizing its imperial vision and an accosted Ukrainian community fighting in the name of self-determination. This war is far more than a theater of war. Ukraine evolved into a real-time drama for racial understanding of terrorism and freedom fighter. And their political ascription in Muslim-majority nations where parallel struggles either continue to rage or are violently crushed. By interrogating the centrality of race within the dialect of freedom and terrorism, this essay examines how realpolitik driving laws and its accompanying discourses is powerfully abetted by racial difference and charged by the indelible resonance of whiteness when it concerns the role of freedom fighter. The war in Ukraine distinctly unfolding alongside similar campaigns in the Middle East in Muslim-majority contexts, a powerful case study illustrating the dissonance. This dissonance colors the framing of non-white Muslims vying for self-determination as terrorists, and white Ukrainians engaged in the same exact acts of freedom, of resistance as freedom fighters. This racial interplay saturates media discourses and scholarly literatures across screens, on walls, to the smaller ones in our palms as new wars converge with pre-existing crusades. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The slogan holds, a credo that rings a broad truth. yet falls short of qualifying how race and racism dictate how these labels are politically imagined, then practically and legally assigned, end quote. This excerpt points out something very conflicting happening on the world stage. Ukrainians are seen as freedom fighters, while Hamas are seen as terrorists. And Russia nor Israel have been labeled or charged with any terrorist activity when all of their actions have strong similarities. This kind of bias leaves Jamina Clay and others like her without the objective definition to call the IDF a terrorist organization, but with the moral compass to reason that if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, well, then it's a duck. As believers in Jesus, Romans 13 tells us to obey the legitimate legal rule of authority. However, the scriptures also assign us the duty of striving against said authority's moral decline and bias. We must realize that when we strive against and infuriate those who are morally destitute and have biased definitions of legality but are in power, we must know that the cross will not always save us from their wrath in the present moment. This is the reason why Pharaoh tormented Moses and the Israelites, why Daniel was thrown into the furnace in the lion's den, while John the Baptist was beheaded, while Peter was burned upside down at the stake, while Stephen was stoned to death, why Nero burnt down Rome and blamed it on the Christians, and ultimately why Jesus was crucified, to name a few. In this world, those who have power and privilege have the pen. The pen that disagrees with Jesus as the objective standard and truth. The pen that gets to rewrite history and definitions of terrorism. The pen that calls Palestinians prisoners, even if Israel captured them and imprisoned them with no charges, but considers Israelis under the same fate to be hostages. The pen that lists collective punishment within the boundaries of self-defense for some people, but hands out indictments and condemnations of terrorism for others. The pen that signs off on your termination if you try to provide any perspective against it or white out over its definitions or laws. Some people like Jamina Clay know it's their calling or urge to fight against the pen. Fighting against the pen has turned many into a cautionary tale. Jamina Clay is in no way guilty of the objective definitions of anti-Semitism. However, she is guilty of colliding with the pen when it was revising history, redefining international law, and separating their subjective selections of who are terrorists and who are freedom fighters. Let her forced resignation not be in vain. Let her encourage you to attack the moral shortcomings of the pen continuously if it's your calling, but be prepared to take the shellacking that comes with its power.